I won't be offended. A couple things about 1 Corinthians. Why is it important for us to study 1 Corinthians, other than the fact that it's in the Bible? Why is it that when Kenny asked me, hey, at some point would you like to teach, the first thing I said was, yeah, I love teaching 1 Corinthians. I've got it outlined. I've taught it many times. I love that book. Why is it that you think I feel that way? Absolutely. When I read through 1 Corinthians, at least, it's exactly like Kenny just talked about. They're not a perfect bunch of Christians. When you read through the book to Philippians, Paul is praising them all the way through the book. He's telling them, how joyful he is to have been associated with them, and what a blessing they've been to him, and everything else. When you read through the two letters to the church in Corinth, there's not a lot of that praise and patting on the back and boy, you're doing a great job. There's a lot of, hey guys, I don't think you really grasp what I was teaching you here. I think you need to fix this. I think you need to do this. And we'll even see later on in 1 Corinthians, there's a list of horrendous sins that Paul talks about that these people in Corinth had been involved in their past lives. Because he lists out those sins, and then the very next thing he says is, and such were some of you. So they were people who had come from various backgrounds, people who had come from not a Christian society, which is the next thing I want to talk about. But they were a young congregation full of imperfect people who were still trying to figure out what it meant to be a Christian and still struggling with those things in their lives. At the time that Paul wrote this letter, and we know it's Paul that wrote this letter, if you look at the very first part of the book here, verse 2, or very first word in the book is Paul, right? And then over in chapter 16, and he also addresses and says that, look at how I wrote this with my own handwriting. Paul wrote this with his own handwriting. So 2 times it's addressed. I don't think there's any question about who the author of the book is. It's the Apostle Paul. Paul went through this church on his second missionary journey. And so just kind of putting things together and trying to figure out, when was Paul there and where's he at now? And when he's writing this letter, he's obviously not still at Corinth. You don't write letters to who you're with. But when you go through and you look at this, in the last chapter, so chapter 16 and verse 8, he says he's writing it from Ephesus. So Paul was in Ephesus many times and crisscrossed that part of the continent several times. So just kind of putting things together, looking at the fact that Paul spent about 1.5 years here in Corinth. He spent about 2 or 3 years in Ephesus. We can say with some confidence that this congregation, starting from absolutely nothing as far as knowledge of Christ, is somewhere around 3 or 4 years old. For those of you who have been Christians for a few years, think back to when you first became a Christian and what you knew 2 to 3, 4 years into being a Christian versus what you know today. How your behavior was then versus what it is now. And you can kind of understand why it is that this church at Corinth was struggling to still kind of get the basics of Christianity down. If we go back to Acts chapter 18, and I'm not going to take the time to necessarily go and read all of Acts chapter 18, but about the first 10 to 15 verses of Acts chapter 18 outline Paul's time in Corinth. And it was really kind of an interesting time. He went there from Athens, so he traveled most likely by land from Athens to Corinth. And then from there, it says that he met up with a couple of interesting people. Who were the people he met up with when he got to Corinth? Aquila and Priscilla. Okay, now why were Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth? Everybody's reading feverishly in Acts 18, trying to remember, right? Don't mean to make you feel uncomfortable. They were there because they were living in Rome, and the emperor at that time had kicked all of the people of Jewish descent out of Rome, so they had to go somewhere. So when you kind of look at the map and look where Rome is, and if they were heading back home, and well, why don't we see if we can catch a ship? And they started east. They pretty much would have sailed straight east into Corinth. So that's probably how they ended up there. The Bible doesn't tell us, but just speculation and kind of looking at the geography of things there. they left Rome and ended up in Corinth. It's kind of interesting, too, that it tells us what Paul's skill was, doesn't it? Acts chapter 18 tells us what did Paul do for a living? He was a tent maker. That's kind of where he hit it off with Aquila and Priscilla, wasn't it? They were all tent makers, and they all got together, and they all made tents, and Paul was teaching them at the same time. We see in verse 5, the older you get, the worse your eyes get. See in verse 5 of Acts chapter 18 that Silas and Timothy also joined them there. And we'll see here in the first few chapters of 1 Corinthians what that caused as far as problems in the church there at Corinth. In Acts 18:6, we see first that Paul went to the synagogue there in Corinth, and he was teaching both the children of Israel, the Jewish nation, and the Gentiles at the same time from the synagogue. And that went along for a little while until he made the mistake of converting Crispus. Crispus just so happened to be the ruler of the synagogue there in Corinth, and that really angered the Jewish people, that Paul had converted him from belief in the Mosaic law to belief that the Messiah had come, had died, and had been resurrected, and now was his Lord and Savior. So Crispus is now a Christian, and as well as all of his household. So shortly after Crispus is converted, we see that Paul has a vision. Christ comes to him for a second time in a vision. The first time, of course, was on the road to Damascus before his conversion. Now the second time we see him coming to a vision here in Paul while he's in Corinth, and he's basically saying, hey, don't worry about what's about to happen because everything's going to be okay. He didn't tell Paul what's about to happen, but basically reassures him, don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. And then we see then that Paul is taken before Gallio. Gallio is the local Roman ruler there in Corinth. And we know that Gallio was there in Corinth from archaeological records around 51 to 52 AD. So we can say pretty certainly, looking back at records, that Aquila and Priscilla were kicked out of Rome just before 50 AD. And then they were there for a couple of years at least before they met Paul. And then Paul was there about 18 months. So most likely 51 to 52 AD is the time period we're talking about for Paul to be there in Corinth, according to what we're told here in Acts. When the Jewish people dragged Paul before Gallio and demand that he do something because he's teaching false doctrine according to them, what's Gallio's response? I don't care. That's a Jewish matter. That's a Jewish religious matter, as a matter of fact. Has nothing to do with Roman law. I don't want to hear it. He could care less. So at this time, it's before we see the emperors starting to persecute Christianity in Rome. So at this point, the people who were there as judges, the people who were there as governors, those type of things, really had an indifference toward Christianity because it didn't affect them. They didn't care whether it was messing up the Jewish religion. They didn't care how the Jews felt about it because they had captured the Jewish nation. So we see that he just says, I don't care. So he dismissed it and said, if this is your matter to handle, it's a Jewish religious matter, you go take care of it. So being good, holy people, they did what we see happen several times throughout the Gospels. They did what they thought was right to uphold their traditions and their law. So they took this new guy, the new ruler of the synagogue, Sosthenes, and they beat him. Not only did they beat him right there in front of the judgment seat in Corinth. And Gallio said, I don't care. Again, it's still a Jewish matter. It's a Jewish religious matter, that type of thing. So that kind of gives you the background on Paul's time there and kind of the nature of the background that he was teaching against. The city of Corinth itself is an interesting city. In this picture here, you see in this area, wrong button. In this area right here, you see that there's a little piece of land there that connects Greece, which is up here at the top, with Achaia, which is down here at the bottom. What are those little pieces of land called? Isthmus, yes. Okay, so you'll notice that on the west side of that isthmus, we're looking north and south here, top to bottom on the picture. On the west side of that, you'll see that there's the city of Corinth, And it doesn't, from this picture at least, look like it's right on the water, but it is. On the east side, you'll see that there's Caesarea. These two cities were the two port cities that were on either side of this isthmus. And from looking at this, it looks like it's a big piece of land. That land's about 3.5 miles, is all that separates the Bay of Corinth on the west to the Aegean Sea on the right. Now, when you look at the somewhat larger picture here, and this shows Paul's journey, you'll see that over in this area, there's a lot of little islands. There's a lot of little things in there that ships have trouble with, and that continues all the way down here to Crete. On this side over here, where the Bay of Corinth is, it's wide open water. So what was happening was anything that was coming in from Europe was coming into the west side, and Corinth was receiving the wealth. Then it would be dispersed throughout Asia or Europe, in that Eastern Europe, by going up through the routes that the Romans had built. Anything coming from the east really had a difficult time. And so a lot of times things coming in from the east and coming up from Egypt would actually sail around to the west side and come in through the Bay of Corinth, because it was just so much easier for them to transport things in and out of Corinth. So Corinth really was a vibrant city, not only during the Grecian time, but also now that the Romans are in charge of it. The Romans have actually, by the time Paul's there, they've gone through and they've rebuilt the entire city. They've rebuilt the entire port. They're really putting a lot of effort into it. And at this time, the city of Corinth is estimated to be about 600 to 800,000 people living in this little area over here on the west side of that little isthmus there. So about 40% of them were free. 40% of them were probably Roman citizens, and they were free or had been granted freedom. The rest of them were people who had either been captured or were indentured servants that were there to serve the free people. There really is another interesting thing about Corinth, and this doesn't have anything to do with Scripture. I just stumbled across it and thought it was really cool. That tells you a little bit about this. By the way, this is Paul's second missionary journey. You'll see that he took off from Antioch, went up through and did his teaching. At Corinth is where at the Caesarea is where he got on the ship to sail back to Antioch. He ended up coming into Caesarea and then traveled by land back up to Antioch. So that just kind of gives you a picture of his second missionary journey, where this was studied, or where this church was established. This is something that I thought was interesting. You guys may say, okay, get on with it, Greg. Who cares? This is a picture of what's called a diolkos. And that's the Greek word for a roadway. What they would do, because the port on the east side of the isthmus was so dangerous, as I mentioned, a lot of the ships would go around to the west and come in through the port, through the Bay of Corinth. They would actually unload the cargo from the ships, drag them across this 3.5 mile stretch of land, put the ship back in the water, and reload the ship, or load what was supposed to be on the ship, and then let them sail out from the other side, because there was so much danger of them losing loads going in and out that it was safer and more economic for them to actually drag the ships across land. The interesting thing is that this was in place until just shortly after Paul was there. After Paul left, this crazy guy who became emperor of the Roman Empire, who was the crazy Roman emperor? Nero. Everybody knows Nero, right? You learned that in 6th grade. Nero came down and he said, we're going to do away with this. We're going to dig a canal. And Nero actually traveled from Rome to Corinth for the first shovel of dirt to be turned over for the canal to connect the two sides of the sea there. That's what the canal looks like today. The only thing that Nero did was ruin the ship's roadway, because once he dug down a little bit, you notice that this whole thing is rock all the way down through there. Once he dug down about 8 feet, he hit this solid rock. And so this canal that's there today wasn't finished until the late 1800s, when French engineers actually came over and finished the canal that Nero started sometime in the 1st century AD. So that gives you a little bit again about, the city. It's a very affluent city. This gives you kind of a layout of the city itself. By the 1st century, like I said, the Romans had started to rebuild the city. And it was a very modern city by Roman terms. There were 4 main roads that intersected into Corinth, going north, south, and kind of northeast. 2 roads going northeast out of Corinth. Very, very central to the trade of the Roman Empire. So a lot of things there going on, a lot of modernization going on, a lot of other things going on there that you would be shocked were going on. Today, when we mention port cities, Brett, you've traveled around the world with the military, right? You've seen port cities, right? You never had a port time? Okay, I'm sorry. I knew you were Army, but I didn't know. I thought maybe you got some time in some ports. So, yeah. Yeah. When you get to a port city, what do you think of? And I'll name off a few of them in the United States that you may be familiar with. How about Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York? Okay, a lot of touristy stuff, a lot of cool, flashy stuff, isn't there? Yeah. Do we think of any of those? I mean, those are just a few that I thought of off the top of my head. Do we think of any of those cities in our country as, man, that's a great place to grow closer to God? Yeah, New Orleans, another one. Yeah, throw Houston in there. Houston's one of the top 5 port cities in the U.S. The answer is no. Yeah, I mean we don't look at any of those cities and say, man, if I could just move to Manhattan and New York, I would be so much closer to God because of what's going on there. If I could just move to Los Angeles or San Francisco, I could grow so much closer to God. None of those. And the same thing is going on here at Corinth. Not only do they have all those things that we're associated with today, the drinking to excess and all the flashy stuff for tourists and all the other stuff, but they also have taken this Egyptian god and this Greek god and this Roman god and this pagan god from the people that they had captured to the north and said, in order to make everybody happy, in order to attract everybody to Corinth, we're going to start building these temples to these gods so that when these people show up, they have some place to go, as well as when these sailors show up, they have some place to go. And the way that they did this, and I'll keep this on a higher level since we have little ears in here, the way that they did this is they attracted them by having princesses serving in the temples to attract the sailors in. Okay? If you don't get that, ask me after class. But they would have these princesses there to attract the sailors in. The sailors would come in, they would feed them, they would do whatever they asked for them, and the sailors would have a lot of money. You had a temple there to Aphrodite. Aphrodite is the god of love. Okay, you had a temple there to Poseidon. He's the god of the sea. If you don't know that, watch Little Mermaid sometime. You'll see it on there. There's a temple there to Apollo. Apollo was attributed to a lot of things that went on, earthquakes and music and weather and everything else. But all around this city, there are these various temples that you see dedicated to these gods from different religions or from different areas of the Mediterranean there that were being built there. The most interesting one was the temple to Octavia. Who's the goddess Octavia? Give you a hint, it's a trick question. Octavia is not a goddess, but she had a temple here in Corinth. She was the sister of Augustus Caesar. And Augustus Caesar thought so much of his sister that after she passed away, he ordered that every major city have a temple to his sister erected so that people could come and pay homage and worship to his sister because he thought she was such a wonderful person and should be paid respect to by having these temples built up. Also, this area in the I keep hitting the wrong button. This area in the center here, Central Forum at this time is the largest marketplace in the Roman Empire. Larger even than Rome because of the trade center that was here in Corinth. They had a huge open marketplace that every day goods would be bought and sold from what was coming in on the ships. You'll notice that they also have a large theater over here, as well as here's the temple. The largest temple was to Octavia. And then over here, just right next to this large marketplace where it says Bema, right here just to the edge of the marketplace, that's actually the judgment seat where Paul was taken during his time in Corinth, where Gallo was there, and he was there before Gallo, and he was, we think of going to court as you go into a building and there's, all this other stuff. It was an open judgment seat here that Gallo sat in every day, and that's why it was so easy for these people to drag Paul up there to have their case heard, because he was right there by the central marketplace and was hearing and passing judgment every day. At this time, there's still a very, very, very strong Greek influence in this city. These people were really into debate. These people were really into just knowledge. Tell me something new. These people were still into philosophy, all the other things that we attribute to the Greek culture. That's what was still going on here in Corinth, and they held these men of philosophy to very high esteem, and continued to hold them in such a place of honor just because of what came out of their mouth. Not that it had any substance, but if it sounded good, they thought it was awesome. To give you an idea of the problems in Corinth and how well known they were as far as their civility, there's actually a Greek word. The Greek word is Corinthianism, and the Greek word has the meaning to play the harlot, basically, is what it means in the Greek language. So that tells you a little bit about what Paul was walking into. Paul was going into a very rough place to try and teach Christianity, a very rough place to try and appeal to someone to have Christianity as part of their lives and to clean up their lives. But he was successful in doing that. We sometimes today say nobody wants to hear the gospel. Nobody's interested in going to church. Nobody wants to do this. Well, Paul walked into a place that was, for all intents and purposes, pretty much like our country today. We don't have the open prostitution and that type of thing that was happening there in Corinth, going on in our cities today. But if you go looking for trouble in Longview, Texas, you can find trouble. If you go looking for whatever it is that you want to do that's a physical pleasure, you can find it here in Longview, Texas. You can find it in Gilmer, Texas. You can find it in any town in America. If you want to find it, you can go and search it out and find it. They were just a little more open with it. But the temptations, the issues, the problems, all those things that Paul was walking into, put them in our society and then multiply them probably times 5 or 10 with the openness that you had going on here in Corinth with all of these different temples and that type of thing that was going on. So the fact that Paul had to write 2 letters back to this congregation to say, hey, you missed some stuff, or here's the answer to your question, that type of thing is not really surprising when you know a little bit about the background of the city, know what was happening there, and really the fact that every day there was this new boat, for lack of a better term, a boatload of influence coming into the city, literally, that was dragging them away from doing what they had been taught as far as the Christian doctrine. So Paul's real purpose in writing this particular letter, he's going to encourage them, he's going to correct them, he's going to answer some questions. We'll see throughout this letter that Paul says, concerning this or about this, and most people agree that there was some sort of communication that had gone to Paul while he was in Ephesus, either a letter that they had written or maybe a list that they had written where they sent it with him sent it to Ephesus and said, hey, while Paul's still in Ephesus, get over there and ask him these questions. We don't know what those questions were. We don't exactly know how they got there. But as we read through the letter, you'll see that there are times where Paul says concerning this or about this, that type of thing, where it seems like he's been prompted to answer a question. Paul deals mainly with a lot of different problems of the heart here in the church at Corinth. We're going to see right away there's division within the church. They haven't physically separated from each other, but their hearts are starting to separate from each other. We'll see that there's fornication in the church. We'll see that there are lawsuits within the church. We'll see that there are problems with marriage within the church. They argue about whether we should or shouldn't eat meals, or how do we eat meals. We'll see that argument spills over into the Lord's Supper, and how that they were taking care of the observance of the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Paul left this congregation with certain people who had spiritual gifts, and we'll see that they even had problems being able to administer these spiritual gifts correctly and being able to know that it was a gift from God and not a gift to glorify them. Later on, we'll also see that they had questions about the resurrection, which many people still do today, as well as Paul in chapter 16 will give them some instruction on the collection as they're supposed to take care of that each week. The problems are still, as I said at the beginning, as when we go through this book, you'll see the problems are really of these people struggling to put aside, lay aside, however you want to say it, put behind them the weight of the world that they carried in with them to Christianity. And each one of us can relate to that. Each one of us can look at ourselves today and say, man, I've been a Christian for fill in the blank number of years, and I still struggle with this today. I still struggle with this temptation. I still struggle with this sin. Or, I thought when I got to be this age, I thought when I knew the Scripture this well, that I wouldn't be tempted by those things again. And we see the same thing happening here in Corinth, and I think that's why as we go through it, you'll see that it really relates to us today in the fact that these were people who were just struggling with living in the world and trying to be a Christian. I will say this. Take about 45 minutes sometime this next week. Start at chapter 1, verse 1, and read it all the way through to chapter 16. And the reason I ask you to do that is for one simple reason. If you go out to the mailbox today and you pull out an envelope and it's addressed to you and you see return address label, oh, that's from my best friend. He took the time to write me a letter. What do you do with it? You go in, turn off the TV, turn off the radio, put away all the distractions, everything, open it up, and you sit down and you put on your glasses and you read it. How many of you read half of the first page, lay it aside, 2 days later come back and finish reading the rest of that first page, 3 days later come back and finally start reading the second page? We don't have any, that sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? None of us read a letter, an email, anything like that. When we get those things, it's like, wow, I have information here. Somebody's telling me something that I haven't heard from in a while, or maybe just some information about someone who I know is sick or suffering or whatever it is, or just, hey, we had a family reunion and here's some pictures type of thing. But yet, when we pick up the New Testament, what do? 7:35. I got about an hour and a half. I'm going to start thinking about bed. If I start reading after 9 o'clock, I'm just going to fall asleep. But there's a ball game coming on at 8 that I want to read, that I want to watch. I got to get in there by 7:50 so my wife doesn't have it on the Hallmark channel instead of the ball game. I'm going to read the first chapter. Then you get about halfway through the first chapter and somebody makes noise or your phone makes a noise and you get a text or Facebook notification or something like that. And what do we end up doing? We read about half of what's called the first chapter of a book and we lay it down, don't we? And then the next night, well, I got to mow the yard, I got to do this, I need to do this, and well, the next night, it's Bible class anyway. I mean, I don't have to read the Bible if I'm going to be in Bible class. I mean, that's kind of redundant. So we don't read it on that day. So then finally by Thursday, we're back to, okay, I'm going to finish reading this now. Oh, shoot, Thursday night, there's an NFL game on tonight. I wonder who's playing. All these distractions, right? So that's why I'm saying take just a few minutes of time. If you get up early in the morning, set your alarm clock 30 or 45 minutes earlier. I don't know how fast you read. Take your Bible with you to work, and if you get an hour for lunch, you can literally read this while you're eating your lunch. But read it as a letter, as the church in Corinth would have received it, because, and this is my opinion, so you're getting exactly what you're paying for. We too often pay attention to the chapters and verses, and my Bible has these little subtitles above certain sections of it. We pay attention to those way too much because it was just people like us that put those in there as a reference. So when I say, hey, let's turn over and read this part of 1 Corinthians, I don't have to say, no, not that paragraph, this paragraph. No, down, no. Don, look, it's over here. It's a reference for us. So we can say chapter 2, verse 3. We can go there and we can read that. Try to block those out as you're reading. Don't look at the subtitles. Don't look at the chapters and the verses, because a lot of times, if you'll notice, there's numbers put in the middle of a sentence. So if you stop at the end of a verse, you're not even getting the complete thought that Paul wrote the sentence in, let alone the thought of the letter that he wrote. So please, try to set aside some time. I'm not going to ask for everybody to raise their hand next week when we get back together. Okay, who read it, who didn't? But the book of 1 Corinthians, as we call it, was a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. It has a lot of stuff in it that is applicable in 21st century America today, that if you read it as it's written, as it was written as a letter, there are parts of it where, I don't care how long you've been a Christian, there are parts of it when you read it as a letter, you see them completely differently than as they're presented book, chapter, and verse. And I'll give you an example that everybody's familiar with. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. How many of you have been to a wedding and heard 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 through 8 read in the wedding? This is where I ask you to raise your hand. Just about everybody here has heard that, or they have a plaque somewhere. Love never fails. What is Paul talking about there? That's right in the middle of chapters 12, 13, and 14, where Paul is giving them instructions on the spiritual gifts that they're struggling with administering correctly, and also how they're supposed to conduct themselves when they gather together for worship. And right in the middle of this transition from spiritual gifts to worship, Paul gives them this little section talking about love. Now, why did he do that? What's the foundation of Christianity? Love, okay? He's telling them, you have these spiritual gifts. This is how you're supposed to act when you come together. But you have to have love to tie these two things together for it to really work. And that's what I mean. This letter was a letter. And if we read it as a letter, we don't pull out 1 Corinthians 13 and say, it's the most beautiful experience, or it's the most beautiful written words of love that's ever been written. It is very beautiful. But it's not written about the love that a husband and wife share. It's not written about the love of, a boyfriend and girlfriend. It's written about the love of us as Christians, and how they were missing that as in their adventures, okay? Any questions? I know I covered a lot of stuff and we didn't read any scripture tonight. Any questions at all about anything that we covered? Because I don't want to dive into the letter and do it injustice by trying to rush through the first part of the letter in the last 5 minutes here. So I'm just going to stop 5 minutes early tonight. Any comments?